Good afternoon. Welcome to the members of Thinkly community to yet another edition of Thinkly Talks. Today, we are lucky to have as a guest Diya Kapur Misra. Diya, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Vivek. It's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. So Diya is a leadership impact coach and a champion for DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Her profile says that she doesn't consider herself to be an expert, because I think quite interestingly, she believes that the moment you call yourself an expert in something, it tends to lead towards stagnation and complacency. So that's a very interesting take. Diya is a graduate in economics honors from Hindu College and a postgraduate from XRI Jamshedpur. She has a very rich and diverse experience across consulting and business with great organizations like Unilever, Hewitt, Cadbury's, and Korn Ferry. And in a career spanning over 2 decades, Diya has touched the lives of over 2,500 leaders and 43 organizations. I must say that's really a huge impact that you've really done, to be able to touch so many lives, right? Very recently, Diya has developed what she calls the power of I, a leadership model for the new world to enable leaders and organizations to thrive and create a sustainable, positive leadership impact, right? So once again, Diya, a warm welcome to you. And, let's begin by really understanding about your journey. I mean, your origin story. How did you, get about this? You started off in a corporate career. And I believe somewhere around April 2016 is when you decided to kind of, become an entrepreneur and a consultant. So just walk us through this.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Vivek. So my career started about 23 years back. I'm one of those people who ended up in HR by choice and not by default, which is the case, unfortunately, still with a lot of people coming into the function, and was the case earlier, certainly. I had exposure to corporate organizations and different functions when I worked with an organization called ISEC in college during my graduation. And as I started to engage with organizations, I realized that there was one function that, in my view, was very, very powerful, could do a lot, could have a phenomenal impact, but was very under-leveraged, and that was human resources. And that kind of drew me to the function. I then was, had the opportunity to study at XLRI Jamshedpur, went there, got a, specialization in human resources, and then started my corporate journey. I started my career with Hindustan Unilever, which is probably one of the best foundations one can ask for in a corporate career. So a really good grounding on, I think, rolling up my sleeves, getting my hands dirty, really understanding business as the base for anything that you do thereafter. And enabling functions in those days weren't very close to the business. They tended to focus on what they needed to do. So I think Hindustan Lever was quite pioneering in that sense. And that's where my foundation, I think, to really get under the skin of the businesses that I work with and understand them deeply before I, diagnose problems or even go close to suggesting solutions, developed. I worked for a few years with Hindustan Lever. Then I moved on to consulting. That was serendipity. It was more a move for personal reasons than professional reasons, because I decided to marry somebody in the Hindustan Unilever. And so I didn't want to kind of mix the, personal and professional. And I worked for 7 years with Hewitt, grew with the organization and really saw the organization grow. I started as employee number 4 in consulting. And by the time I moved out, the organization across all its verticals had over 4,000 people. So it was a huge phase of growth. From there, I then went back into business and I worked with Cadbury's. That choice was a very conscious one, because I had, I think, become a consultant very early in my career. And I felt that going back into business would solidify my own real practical experience to make me a better consultant. So I was very clear that in the long run, my ambition and aspiration was consulting, because that's what really drives me, the variety of consulting experiences and the impact that you talked about. Only consulting gives you that kind of landscape to make that kind of widespread impact. But I wanted to go back into business. So I did that. I was with Cadbury's for a couple of years. Again, fabulous experience with a really great organization. And Cadbury's got acquired then by Kraft. And so, also saw, that journey, which is an interesting one in any professional career. And then I went back to my first love, consulting, with Korn Ferry. I was with Korn Ferry as a partner in the Mumbai office, set up the team in Mumbai, led the business here in Mumbai, built the business. A very, very interesting phase. And again, some fabulous client opportunities. And then, like you said rightly, in 2016, about 7.5 years back, I decided to take the plunge and become an entrepreneur. And that's been a whole different ball game and a very, very interesting journey since then. So yeah, that's my kind of career in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So I think in many ways, I mean, the kind of role that you did, the pioneering work that you did with the Hindustan Lever, and then when you went across, let's say, to even, Hewitt and Conferry, I mean, it was very entrepreneurial in nature, right? Because you were among the first employees, really
Yeah.
setting the tone. And so I think in some ways or the other, you've always been an entrepreneur over your last 23 years before you kind of, became a actual entrepreneur in that sense, right?
Yeah. Those were opportunities to be an entrepreneur with the safety net of an organization. That's
Yeah, you realize that once you are an actual entrepreneur, right? The whole comfort of getting a check at the end of the day, end of the month, right? So now that you're kind of dabbling in leadership, especially, and then of course the other passion on DEI, but what exactly does being a leadership coach entail today? Just try and help us understand why do we need a leadership coach? And we've got just so many. If you look at all these, there are startups at one side, and then there are obviously corporates at the other side, right? And why does both of them? Why do kind of need a leadership coach?
Yeah, sure. So my husband jokes that these days, if you turn a rock, you find a coach under it, which is unfortunately becoming true, because I think a lot of people, when they decide that they want to go the gig route or have just retired from a, successful corporate career, coaching seems to be the next kind of obvious thing to do. But on a more serious note, I think the essential role of a coach is as an enabler. So a coach enables, be it individuals, teams, or organizations, to put their best foot forward and thrive in a situation. It could be a positive situation and you're looking to accelerate growth, or it could be a problem situation that you're looking to come out of. But a coach is kind of enabling you to be able to seek answers and different ways to look at a situation and then move forward. So it's about progress. It's about moving to a better place, moving forward, either for individuals or teams or organizations. And by that definition, I think every individual and every team and organization can only benefit from, a coaching relationship or having somebody who has their back and is enabling them through the journey of, life. I think coaching very often gets confused with mentoring, gets confused with counseling, and a lot of these things are in a similar realm but different. And the fundamental difference that I'll just call out is that, without getting too technical, is that coaching is not about giving you the answers. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating because a coach asks you lots of questions and doesn't tell you, and you'll have coaches who will say, "Yaar, mujhe bata do, karna kya hai," right? But the coach fundamentally doesn't come from a place of thinking that I know better than you and I'm going to tell you what to do. But a coach comes from a perspective of saying, I'm going to help you look at the situation from perspectives that you may not have thought of. And I'm going to help you ask the right questions and find the answers. But the answers will actually come from the interaction and come from the individual or the team itself. So that's really coaching. And which is why I think organizations at various stages in their life journey, whether it's a startup or it's an established organization, always benefit from, a coaching input. And individuals as well.
Great. My personal observation is, having been through some of this in my corporate life and then actually going through, life coaching once recently. I'm just seeing this major movement towards, I think initially it used to be very, very techniques oriented. Was about giving you a toolkit, about giving a framework to kind of work with, right? I think over the years, it seems to have evolved more and more about understanding oneself. It's really been about finding your sense of values, your sense of purpose, and consciousness. What are you really about? And then once you understand your inward, really focusing outward. Yeah. In a personal journey, I've seen that. I mean, could you relate to that? Do you think that that's how coaching has evolved?
So absolutely, I think I think to my mind there is a science and there is an art in coaching, and they're both very, very valuable and needed. And a balance between them is always makes one a better coach. And I think the coachee or the organization benefits from it. The science is the toolkit that you talked about. So it could be the methodology, the process, the tools, diagnostic, assessments that will help you uncover the situation and diagnose it objectively. And that's very important, I think, because it brings an objective view to the situation, which is not laced with, past baggage or emotions, etc. So that's one part of it. Having said that, there is an art, there is a style, and every coach brings a different personal style to the equation and to the interaction. And I think there's a third leg, which is very crucial, which is which is what I think lay a huge premium on, which is understanding the context very deeply. You can have all the art and the style of being a great coach. You can have, the science and the tools and all of that. But if you apply both of these devoid of understanding of context, I think it doesn't get you anywhere. And when I say context, it could be the individual's context in terms of phase of life and, challenges and past and future aspirations, or it could be the organization's context and the business. And I think understanding that really deeply, as if you are an insider, and then taking a step out and approaching the situation as a coach, as an outsider who's objective, is what I think brings out the beauty of, the power of coaching.
There's a question here from Samir Mehta. He's saying that, do you have any specific methods you have used to help leaders enhance their decision-making ability and the problem-solving, ability? Any anecdote or any thought that you could probably, bring out here?
Sure. So, approaches, there are many, and methodologies, there are many. And as a coach, what I try and do is to kind of arm myself with a toolkit which has many, many different frameworks and approaches in it. And then having understood the context to bring the right things to bear. But let me share, one of the things that I've realized over a period of time as a coach working with, very senior leaders is that we always look for supermen and superwomen in leaders, and we look up and we assume that they know it all and they should have all the answers, and they should kind of know exactly what to do to come out of every situation. But actually that's very far from the truth, right? Because leaders are human, and more in the businesses that in the business world and in life in general that we're facing, the last few years are the best example of that. We're all facing unprecedented problems and situations. So we don't really have the answers. We don't have a playbook to say, acha, humne, 1974 mein is problem ko aise solve kiya tha, so we'll apply the same solution, because the context is completely different. And therefore, the answers don't lie with any one individual. The answers actually lie with the collective. And hence, the very, very important thing I think that we need to enable leaders to do is to be able to lead inclusively. And that's the whole premise of my Power of I piece, which is to say that if I can be inclusive as a leader and know how to be able to bring out the best from a diverse pool of people in my organization who come with diverse experiences, skills, and perspectives, then together we will find the answers. So decision-making is therefore no longer the mantle of a few people or one individual, but it is about collective decision-making and co-creating the future of an organization. But for that, there are very fundamental shifts that leaders need to make, right? So you need much more humility. You need to be able to let go. You need to be able to enable others. You need to be able to embrace people who are very different from you and not judge them. And it's a whole different ballgame.
It sounds very fascinating. I'm sure you must be really enjoying this whole journey of interacting with all these leaders, or making really, like you said, ordinary men, turning them into leaders, right? Because there's no Supermans also involved, right? The whole process must be pretty fulfilling.
I love my work. I wake up in the morning raring to get out of bed. I really love my work, and I consider myself very fortunate to be in that space.
Wonderful. So just moving along a bit and just, kind of moving across to the next topic that you're very passionate about, DEI, right? Tell us about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really try and help us understand why is it so important.
So, in my head, interestingly, they're not even two different topics. Yeah. So DEI and leadership, to my mind, are actually now more and more two sides of the same coin. And the reason I say that is because, like I just said, to be a good leader in the world that we live in today and in the way the world is shaping up in the future, there is no option but to be an inclusive leader. If you want to survive and you want to thrive in the world and in the business, and corporate world, and enable your organizations to be high growth organizations in this challenging context, I don't think there is an option but for leaders to embrace diversity and inclusion. And when I say that, it's because innovation and problem solving is going to come from diverse opinions and diverse experiences and skills. If you put a bunch of similar people in the room, you will never crack a problem, right? So you have to have diversity of opinions, diversity of perspective in teams, in organizations. And in order to enable that diversity to actually come into your organization, thrive in your organization, survive, and do well, and actually leverage the power of that diversity, if you don't have an inclusive culture, which is, created by inclusive leaders, that diversity is no point. So we see enough organizations around us who set diversity metrics and say, we need X percentage women, or we need, Y percentage people with a disability, or we need, different mix of, let's say, race or culture or whatever. And they keep hiring people and they keep losing people. And the reason for that is because it's easier to bring in diverse talent, but it's far harder to retain it and to be able to actually leverage it and have it thrive in the organization. And the only way that can happen is if the leaders are inclusive. So to me, DEI and leadership are very, very closely connected. They go hand in hand. And I would almost argue, while the coin that has been termed over the years has become DE&I, so, you lead with diversity, equity, and then comes inclusion, I would actually say we need to put the I at the beginning. Because if we build an inclusive culture and inclusive leadership, then we will actually be able to bring in and retain the diversity. And of course, equity is an important part of it in order for people to be able to give their best. So to me, the I actually leads the D.
Great. So, I think from your point of view, the whole issue around attrition is really about lack of effective leadership, or really is an issue of leadership rather than an HR problem, right? Because the moment you kind of lead in an organization where you are very, very inclusive, when your starting point is about inclusivity, it kind of changes the way the organization functions. Would that be correct?
So, attrition happens for various reasons, right? One, people either leave because they got a better opportunity elsewhere. And I think that's positive attrition. If your people are getting great opportunities elsewhere, that's great. And they'll go out as brand ambassadors for you. So some of that you have to embrace. But attrition also happens because people are leaving your organization. And I think that's the one that has to be addressed. And that, like you rightly said, more often than not is a leadership issue and not an HR issue. HR manages it operationally. Correct. But it is absolutely a leadership issue, and the solution lies in leadership as well.
I think a great point. With this, I just wanted to kind of share a meme with you. Selvan, if you could just probably bring out that meme. Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with this meme. It's actually, come up with this gentleman called Craig Fraley. So this is actually a very interesting representation of really about trying to bring about the point as to how equality and equity are two very different points. Absolutely. Like how you can see here, right? Obviously the people with, with different abilities, in this case, the height representing that, right? And I think the whole point of this message really out here is the fact that, while equality typically focuses on having the same starting line, equity is really focused about providing everybody with the full range of, opportunities and benefits and giving them the same outcome, the same finishing line, right? So what's your thought to this one?
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. This is something that I've used and continue to use very often to just illustrate the point that equity and equality are not one and the same thing. Because if the starting point is different for different people, but you want to get them to the same finishing line so that they have, all of them have an equal amount or a adequate amount of impact and outcome, then there is a need for differential treatment, right? And there is a need for differentiation. But it needs to be fair and it needs to be transparent. So I think the only point I will make is that that's one of the reasons organizations shy away from differential treatment is because it could be judged as being unfair. As long as I think the rational reason for it and the fairness around it is established and it is transparently communicated, I think absolutely there is a need for differentiation if equity is to be driven.
Nice. And there's a very nice, variation to this meme. If you can have the next one. Yeah. So this one actually says that the fundamental thing that you're trying to do is actually trying to move towards removal of the systemic barriers.
Yeah.
And I think that is really a pretty utopian approach, right? Because obviously what you're trying to say is that, there are no barriers really that we should be worrying about in that sense, right? And the question is, can one really remove systemic barriers, And what are the systemic barriers that marginalized communities face in institution, be it corporate life or be it education? Any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. So, this is an ideal state, right? If the systemic barriers can be taken away, then you're not arguing about how high the stool should be, but instead you just do away with the problem, right, from its root.
Right.
But I think, unfortunately, like you rightly alluded to it, I think often that is easier said than done, or often it is easier pictorially represented than, implemented. Because a lot of the systemic barriers are complex issues. They are not unidimensional. And there is an interplay of organizations, community, educational institutions, media, family structures, right? There are so many things which are at play. So as an organization, I think corporate organizations often struggle with the fact that there are things beyond their control which are impacting, their employees, etc. And they're not really able to change that, right? So if I have somebody coming to work and I can look at policies and systems within the organization, but I have very little control over the environment that they go back to or the family structure they operate in and so on and so forth. So those are very complex problems. And I think bit by bit, as different social and economic structures start to hopefully progress and change, those things will move forward. But I always look at it as saying, we can always wish away a problem and say that it's very complex and I can do only so much. But my question always is, so are you doing what you can do? Because if each of us waits for the other part of the structure to change, we'll have scary reports like saying, it's going to take 130 odd years for there to be, gender equity in corporate organizations. And really do we have the luxury of waiting for 130 years because the problems we're facing are today. So everyone can't wait for some other structure to change. I think each of us has got to do what we can within our space of influence and control.
Right.
If this is to change.
Absolutely. And, I think, like you rightly said, it's a very nuanced issue, right? I mean, half the time we try to come at it with looking for the silver bullet or, with like a hammer and just trying to kind of, address this. But the fact of the matter is that there are so many things at play, right? There are things that you can control at the organization level. But then there are things that you cannot even touch when it, let's say, goes back to socioeconomic, structures that are there in society, or what is really the domestic situation that the person is facing. I mean, there's just so much of diversity, right? So, I mean, that's going to be an inherent problem to that, right? And, I kind of love the third meme, if you could have that. This one is my favorite. If you could just say in the slide, please, Selvin. So this really shows that what actually happens in your life, right? I mean, you have sometimes politicians or people in power, kind of using this whole thing about equality and equity, waving up all of that, promising things. But in effect, the common man actually end of the day just gets bears the brunt of it, right? I mean, because you have, come election time, you have all these promises and, you've got all these, populism coming in the wake of this, right? I mean, so any thoughts on that? I mean, I just think it's a hard reflection of the society that we live in.
Yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, I mean, doles and benefits being kind of, distributed in order to gain benefits, whether political or otherwise, is something that we've lived with, and not only in this country, but it exists around the world. It exists in different shapes and forms, in different economies and social structures. But absolutely, this is a reality. I think there's no getting away from it. And therefore, I keep coming back to the question of saying, okay, if I believe as an individual, I can't do anything about this, what can I do something about? Right. So within my own sphere of influence, what can I change? And it has to start, I think, with my family, my ecosystem, my help, my, all of us have a social structure around us that allows us to do what we do. And there is a lot more that we can do to change that than we give ourselves credit for.
So I think really some great interesting points out here, and, just to kind of think about the other side of the debate, because like you said, I mean, obviously, we are looking at a utopian ideal of having no systemic barriers. And then, of course, because we can't do that, we think about having different outcomes or same outcomes for different people. So in some ways, trying to giving people a different starting line because of the fact that, they were privileged or they had, their own, what should I say, drawbacks and, obstacles in life. And that therein lies in the criticism around DEI, right? I mean, in fact, there's a question here from Darth Vader, and he's actually saying that, how do you handle prejudice against inclusion and perception that it is against, or at least affects merits negatively, right? And I'll just kind of build on that. Like, you talked about the fact that how you don't just see it in India. I mean, in fact, India, if you look at it, affirmative action there's no really debate about that because it's enshrined in the Constitution, under Article 15, subsection 4, 5, and 6. It's a part of the Constitution which allows state to really differentiate, based on really on the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribe, and the economic backward classes, right? But you know what was interesting is that even in a country like America, there was affirmative action, which honestly I wasn't aware of, right? Until the Supreme Court kind of struck down the whole ruling out there, right? And they believe that that's actually going against the grain when it comes to the whole meritocratic structure that you have in the US, right? Similarly, there was another bill that was passed, I think, in Texas, maybe around a couple of months back, which says that any DI office in any education institution will be banned, because instead of promoting equality and equity, it's actually bringing in divisiveness. So would love to try and understand this from, because there's I'm sure there's something that you kind of deal with, right? And would love to get your perspective.
No, absolutely. I think there is often this perceived clash between, DEI and merit, right? Or performance focus. And I think to me, the realization in, through the work that I do is that there is in fact no clash. But I think what's very important is how DEI gets implemented in an organizational structure. And the reason I say that is that if an organization is very clear that the best person for the job will get the job, right? And I'm using this as a simple example. So if I'm hiring for a job and I'm very clear that I want to try and bring in diverse talent, but I will not compromise on merit and performance, it's actually much harder work, because what it means is that in the pipeline of candidates that I bring for the job, I have got to ensure that I'm casting the net much wider, bringing in many more candidates with very, very diverse experiences and perspectives, and giving them all a fair chance at that job. Yeah. The problem that happens is that we're always in a hurry, and we therefore try and take shortcuts to sort of, whether it's to close jobs or whether it's to solve problems. And that is where then the problem comes up, where we sometimes could end up using DEI as a crutch to say, oh, but we need to hire more women, so we've hired a woman. And then when she fails at the job, we say, oh, but it was because there was a bias, right? It was a positive bias. And I think being able to sort of safeguard the performance ethic, the metric-based, merit-based culture, but also embrace DEI and bring in diversity is much harder work for leaders. And unless we're willing to put in the hard work, there will always be this perceived clash, which is why also I go back to saying that to me, DEI is a leadership problem. It is not about setting up a DEI office. It is not about just a bunch of policies and saying that, here's this one person who's going to be the custodian of DEI. Every leader in the organization is a custodian of DEI. And unless it percolates and becomes a part of the DNA of the organization, it will not be done right. Because then it will be only a policy-driven thing or like a unidimensional practice.
So there are many questions, really reacting on that. Just trying to conflate some of them. I mean, there's a question from Aaron, Shinu, Samera. I think they're all trying to kind of get to the whole crux of it, that how have organizations been really effective? I mean, are they in the case studies, either Indian or global, that you've really seen them, and I think, like you rightly said, it's not about doing virtue signaling by setting up a DI office, but it's really about embracing it and making it a part of the culture, right? I mean, is there anything that you kind of going to shed some more light on in terms of, very few relevant examples?
So there are many organizations that I'm seeing making an effort in the right direction in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years. There are a number of organizations that I work with and I interact with, and I see some very good stuff that they're doing. Have I yet come across any one organization which has figured it all out and got it all right? Quite honestly, no, because I think the goalpost also shifts, right? Things get more challenging every year. A lot of organizations had found great policies and practices to be able to address these things. Hindustan Lever itself is a great example, on gender, for instance, of an organization that got to a very good place several years back. And then came COVID, and then the whole context changed, right? And the problem became a very different one to solve. So I think the goalpost shifts, and therefore practices and policies also need to continue to evolve. But which is why I say that if the leadership is inclusive and the DNA of the organization and the culture that starts to get built is one that understands and focuses on being an inclusive organization, not simply because it's a nice thing to do, but because it makes business sense, right? There's no other way. I genuinely believe there is no other way for organizations in a challenging context to actually continue to do well. You need that diversity. And if you understand that and you accept it and embrace it and start building it into the way you think and operate as an organization across the board, then you evolve as things keep changing. But if people are looking for specific examples of organizations, there are a whole bunch of organizations that are doing great work in this space, right? So like I said, Hindustan Lever is one of them. Google is another organization. IBM is a third organization. A lot of organizations, particularly in the tech space, because they have had large workforces and large employee pools, and they've had a multi-geography presence, have had to look at DEI very strongly and embrace it much before many other organizations and sectors. So I certainly see, big steps and strides being taken by many, many organizations, but I think they still have a long way to go to get to a place where it's kind of across the board and it's ticking all the boxes. And then there are many organizations, unfortunately, which are also still only paying lip service. One of the interesting things I've seen is that a lot of organizations have CEOs that are doing a lot in this space. They believe they're progressive. They believe in the power and benefit of DEI, but they haven't done enough work to strengthen the second line thinking. So there's one individual who's kind of holding up the beacon for the need for diversity and inclusion, but it's not supported. So there's cynicism at the next level, and then as a result, what happens is execution breaks down. So it has to percolate from the top, but I think it has to go far deeper within the organization.
There's a friend of mine who was, kind of sharing with me the experience. She works with the Indian, private bank. And, in one of her arguments with the boss, where her boss lost it and said, what would you know? You're just a diversity hire, and, you can imagine the kind of pain that people go through, right? And I think the messaging, I think that you rightly talked about in your earlier point, that how diversity does not mean lack of meritocracy, right? I mean, the fact is that you're just looking harder and harder and further to kind of get the right, but you're probably having the same expectation. I think that messaging needs to be really strengthened. And I believe, like you said, I mean, not only at the CEO level, probably also in the board, and I think all the way down line, right? Because otherwise you'll really have people kind of, misrepresenting the whole point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've all had these experiences. I mean, I could write a book on experiences as a working woman, and in most rooms, in most situations. I mean, 20 years back, and even 20 years back, even 5-7 years back, I was the only woman in so many forums and situations, and there are always anecdotes and stories related to that. I mean, that's what drives me, honestly, to do the work that I do. That I have 2 daughters, and if I can make some contribution to ensure that the world that they grow up in and work in is different from the one that I had to battle. That's what drives me to do the work that I do.
No, I think a lot has changed, I think, over the last 20 years because of, some of the work that all the organizations have been doing. I think, especially when you live, let's say, in a tier 1 city in India, I mean, I don't think so many women would necessarily, feel the whole thing. Of course, there'll always be that one or stray cases. There'll always be, kind of an outlier in that sense. But I think largely, I mean, I think that it's really a part of a life now, right? In that sense.
A lot has changed, and yet sometimes I feel not
a lot needs to be done.
I think the one thing that hasn't shifted, and I think that's a very big unlock which is needed, is that caregiving responsibility in this country, and not just in this country, but the world over, still rests largely on the shoulders of women. And I think till that changes, that will always remain an obstacle to DEI and to growth.
So this, I think, brings us to a very interesting point, because, some of these are really fundamental issues, right? Because, I mean, you're talking about, let's say, for example, we are I would say we used to be, but truth is we still are a patriarchal society, right? In that sense. I mean, that's the starting point, right? And when people grow up in that, I mean, whether they like it or not, there are certain unconscious biases at play already, whether you realize it. But the fact is that, people obviously don't intend it that way. It's just that, there are some biases which kind of creep in, right? So whether an organization is doing something about it or not, what can each individual do, in terms of being aware of their, unconscious biases, and how to kind of address that? Because I don't think so most professionals really want to bring that in, it just ends up, kind of seeping in, right? So any thoughts about that? I mean, in your coaching, how do you kind of, help, people understand about that, about the biases and address it?
Yeah, I think we all carry them. Some of us are more privileged than others because we've just had, access to different opportunities. And I mean, I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where I was an only child. And I don't think I even realized I was a, woman in a sense for many, many years, because my parents just treated me like their child. And, it wasn't nuanced by gender. It's only when I went out into the world, when I joined Delhi University and left the cocoon of my family and my school, that I suddenly realized what it meant to be, a young woman out in the world, and the fact that it did carry a lot of, implications. So I think each of us, so those of us who come from more privileged backgrounds, and when I say privileged, it could be social, it could be economic, it could be even today the lives that we're leading. I think the onus on us to be able to recognize unconscious biases in ourselves and around us, and to be able to call them out, and not just call them out from a cynical stance to sort of point fingers, but to actually help and enable for it to get better. I think the onus lies on us very, very strongly. So I really do believe that that's one take. And honestly, it's not rocket science. You don't need a scientific assessment tool to tell you about biases that are around you or biases that you see and face. You just need to have your eyes and ears open. And I think you need to be listening to what's happening around you, listening to what's being said and listening to what's not being said. So one is us and, what we see around us. My kids joke about this because, we're constantly in situations where I will call things out which I'm seeing happening, even though it may not be happening to me. And they almost get embarrassed sometimes, but I think secretly they kind of love it, to say that, mom is this militant who, why do you always have to be the one to speak up? And I genuinely do believe that those of us who are observing, if we remain silent bystanders because it's not happening to me, is the worst thing that we can do. Because we have the privilege of the confidence and the courage to be able to speak up. And those could be little things or big things, right? A simple thing like if I am standing in a queue to get work done in a government office, and I can see that I am dealt with differently to the next person next to me because that person looks less affluent or cannot fill a form in English, I will call it out, right? Or I will enable it for that person because I can see that's a different kind of bias that is playing out. So little things and big things, I think that happen all around us, we need to call out. The other is that those of us who've come from, backgrounds of bias where, it still happens in our environments, whether in our families or in our neighborhood, etc. We've got to find a way to be able to, because we've been able to come out of it, is to go back in and to be able to change it around us. And in the social sector, I sit on the advisory board of a couple of social purpose organizations, and I'm just always amazed with a lot of fabulous people in that sector who are doing phenomenal work exactly in this space, because many of them have actually risen from the communities that they're working with, and they've found a better life and found a way out, and they're going back into their communities now to try and make a difference, because nobody understands the community and its challenges better than them. So I think the onus is on both, right? Those of us who've had privilege and those of us who've not, but have still been able to break out of it and find a way out.
And, Diya, if you were to kind of just think about it in terms of, when you talk about inclusivity, of course, there are different aspects to it. One is, of course, the whole gender equity that we're talking about. The second is, in India, obviously, you have the caste, then you have the class, and then you have the fourth, you could probably say disabilities, right? In that sense, people who are, and maybe some more, that you would want to.
Religion,
what is your view?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Religion, which we often don't want to talk about.
Yeah. Let's not talk about it. So I think,
no, absolutely.
But I think if you were to kind of address it, where do you think, let's just keep it focused on corporate India. Where do you think we made good headway? I personally, I feel when it comes to gender equity, I think we've come a long way. But since you're in the field, do you have any perspective on these 4 points?
So I think, relatively speaking, certainly, among the 4, so I was to say there are 4, I think, sort of spaces of, underrepresentation that have existed in corporate India. Like you rightly said, gender is 1, people with disabilities the 2nd, people coming from different, sexual backgrounds, sexual preferences, etc. is the 3rd, which is, more and more now being talked about. And also since, the Supreme Court ruling and changes in law a few years back, at least it's out and being discussed more. And the 4th is also just, small groups like, so army veterans and things like that, right? So there are a lot of organizations focusing on mainstreaming people with armed forces background and bringing them into the corporate sector thereafter, because they have many, many years of productive service. So there are, then there are micro communities like that. Amongst all of these, certainly, I think the most movement has been made on gender. And, I look at it very simply. I think the reason for that is because gender is the most obvious. Looking at you, I can tell if you're a man or a woman, right? And therefore, it is the easiest one.
Can you?
Yeah. I mean, I'm
Can you
saying,
put it?
yeah, sure. I agree. Yes, it's not binary.
We'll come back
I
to
agree.
that. We'll
Yeah,
come
I
back to
agree.
that.
Gender,
Yeah.
you make a fair point. I mean, gender is not binary, but I'm just saying, all said and done, relatively, I can't, a lot of other things, I don't want to make assumptions around, right? So organizations, because gender is the most visible, it's relatively easier to track, is the point I was making, right? From a metric point of view. So if I want to track to say percentage of women at different levels, etc., I can still do that. With a lot of the other things, that's far harder. And so I think, yes, gender has been the the one that has got most focused on. Many organizations I work with, in their minds, DEI is equal to gender, right? They don't think about that yet. Their starting point has been gender. So gender, relatively speaking, yes, I think has made the most progress amongst them. But like I said earlier, I mean, would I say that, yeah, we're in a good place? I think there's a lot more work still to be done. On the others, I think very small baby steps are now being taken. And the numbers are just astounding. If you look at the number of people with disability in this country, right, it's in millions. And the percentage of them who are actually gainfully employed is abysmal, because they don't find gainful employment. So, those are things which I think there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. There are organizations which have done fabulous work in that space. The Lemon Tree Hotels is a great example that comes to my mind, which has done a lot of work with, people who are hearing impaired, etc. And made a success story of it, right? And what I love about some of these organizations is that they've not just done great work in that area, but they go out and talk about it and spread the message. And they are always willing to go into any other organization, talk about the work they've done, lend their own, time, invest their own effort, energy, because they want the movement to spread beyond just what they are doing. So yeah, there are these beacons of, organizations which have done work in specific areas, but there's a long journey still to be traversed.
Right. Just touching upon the point that, we just, messing around a bit with you, was about, the whole thing about the sexual preference, right? I mean, if you look at, the Gen X, the Gen Y, and definitely the baby boomer generation, right? I mean, we all grew up with this whole understanding of there are only two genders, right? I mean, and that's just the way it was. And of course, there is something called the others. But what we're seeing now happening at the workplace, and especially now working with younger and younger, the millennials, the Gen Z, right? Suddenly this whole thing about this, may I say, a very aggressive stance about the fact that there are no two genders. There are, in fact, multiple of them. And, I think I've heard about as many as 30, 40, 72 at last count. And how does one deal with this? Because obviously there's a voice, and, I think there's a thin line between acceptance and then really extreme wokeism in that sense, right? And, so I think that's becoming a challenge, right? And I mean, just to kind of stay with that point for a bit is, if you look at, let's say, corporate America, I mean, they're really struggling because you've got brands trying to really do the virtue signaling, like you saw the Bud Light campaign that did, and they had, really egg all over the face. You had Target trying to do the same thing, right? And I think it's a matter of time that you'll actually see Indian brands wondering whether they need to go down that path, because they've already touched the path about gays and lesbianism, right, through those very ads and everything, right? So just would love to get your perspective on that. What are the leaders in the boardroom thinking about this, right?
So I think there is a thin line and there is a nuance between gender and gender identity. So there is gender by birth, and then there is gender identity. And then there is sexual preference, and they're two different things. And a lot of times I find that people kind of use them interchangeably. So I think one piece, I think, is that all of us need to go out and educate ourselves. And I've gone through my own education. It's not like, 15 years back, I understood all of these issues.
Yeah.
But I have made the effort to go out and educate myself and learn more. I've needed to do it as a professional. Very importantly, I've needed to do it as a mother. And I think all of us, as we get into roles as parents, or, we have nieces and nephews. And like you said, the younger generation is a lot more vocal and a lot more, I think, open than we ever were. I think we owe it to them to therefore educate ourselves to be able to have, honest, forthright and sensible conversations with them. In the absence of knowledge and awareness, I think we will always have, emotional conversations which are irrational and which are not based on fact. So that's one. I think the education, the awareness piece. How are the boardrooms and leaders dealing with it? Most of them are still very uncomfortable. So the number of organizations or leadership teams or boards that I see being able to have conversations about, gender identity, the fact that gender is not binary, about people from communities with different sexual preferences. There is lack of awareness. Like I said, there is ignorance to begin with, and there is discomfort. And I think ignorance and discomfort are the worst combination possible, right? So discomfort will take time to go away, but at the least we can do is to at least educate ourselves and get rid of the ignorance first. And accept the fact that, look, this is something I didn't grow up with. I don't know enough about it, but I'm willing to find out, and I am uncomfortable. And that's fine. I don't think anyone expects. I have friends who have, different sexual preferences, who have, different gender identity. They don't expect me to understand it all immediately, but they want to see me make the effort. They want to see that I care enough to want to know. And then, for us to be able to have a conversation and for me to evolve as I go along in those conversations. So I think education around this and building awareness around this is something that certainly organizations can do a lot more of as a first starting point. I think comfort with it will come further down the road. We're some distance away from there.
There's a question here from Rahila. She's saying that, look, as a LinkedIn top voice on gender equity, what inspired you to use social media as a platform to advocate for gender equality, and what kind of impact have you seen as a result?
So, I started using social media only a few years back, and I always shied away from it. And I will go so far as to say that I think a lot of women do. In women leaders that I work with, I find many of them to be very hesitant about using social media. They don't have the time or don't want to take out the time from, between caregiving responsibilities and work. They can just about, keep their head above water. So to be able to just take time out, social media is time consuming. But I realized that there is actually no better platform if you really want to have a voice. And to me, it became about the voice I wanted to have about things that I care about. So if there is something that you care about and you want to be able to therefore talk about it and read about it and educate yourself about it, I think there's no better platform today than social media. You need to obviously use it, with the right caution and with the right intent. Yeah, that's very important. I started putting out what I believe strongly about on social media. I primarily use LinkedIn because for me, my audience is largely on LinkedIn. The audience that I work with, and that is kind of my target audience. I have to say, I'm still my kids laugh. I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she's constantly trying to get me more active. I have an account on Instagram. I'm not very active on it, and she keeps trying to tell me, LinkedIn is fine, but you need to be more active, etc. I'm yet to get there. I started putting out stuff that I believe in on LinkedIn. And I found that what it did for me was two things. One, it gave me a chance to express myself without any kind of filters and any, boundaries in that sense, right? Obviously, I was self-monitoring, but that was it. The second is that it brought like-minded people to me. So a lot of people who believe in the same value systems, who are troubled by the same things around the world that I am, reach out as a result of that, right? Besides just, a thumbs up, like, which is the easiest thing to do, which many people do. But there are people who will put in a meaningful comment, who'll write into me one-on-one. So over the last some years, I've made some wonderful connections with like-minded people, and many, many interesting and beautiful sort of collaborations or just exchange of ideas has happened as a result of that. And to me, that's very meaningful because I continue to grow. Like I said, I'm a work in progress, right? I continue to grow as a result of those interactions. And hopefully somewhere with the stuff that I'm putting out, I'm influencing other people as well. So if I've built a certain credibility professionally over the last 23 years and, people believe that, when she says something, it's sensible, it's worth reading, worth sort of listening to, then hopefully I'm able to use that credibility for the right things and to be able to raise my voice against things which need to change and ought to change around us in society.
No, great. I think social media really depends upon, it's a great tool, depends upon how you're able to use it. And especially to kind of make those connections, make new friends, it's a wonderful tool. And in fact, we would love you to spend more time on Thinkly. I mean, yes. Especially in the community, maybe after this chat, you could probably run through the chats and see the comments that people have. And I obviously couldn't do justice to all the questions, but, it'd be great if you could do that. There's a question here from Ahana, and You said, what is that one book, resource, or piece of advice that that has had a significant impact on your approach towards leadership, coaching? And I would maybe like to add on to that. What is that one resource that you would like us all to read? Because I think, one of the things that you talked about was about education and, educating ourselves, right? I mean, any thoughts on that?
I'm just trying to see. In fact, there are a couple of books I have here. So there are a whole bunch of things, honestly, but one is, like I said, one very important thing that I would call out first and foremost is understand context, right? And that applies actually, I think, across the board, whether you're coaching or whether you're problem solving. I think don't jump to, we as human beings, we very often jump to trying to solve a problem or give advice without really immersing ourselves in and understanding the context and the problem. And it sounds probably very, very obvious, but we don't do enough of it. So, I mean, that's the one thing I would say first. Anna, thank you for asking that question. But the first thing I would say is that, do that. As far as resources go, I mean, there are a whole bunch of things. So one of the books that I would highly recommend, particularly, to people interested in DAI or even women, who are with aspirations, wanting to build their careers, is a book called How Women Rise. It's not a very difficult read. I have it somewhere here on my bookcase. It's not a difficult read. It's a fairly thin book. It's a beautifully written book. Very, very practical, very, very kind of easy. The other one which is what I'm currently reading, which is this book, The Coaching Habit. Say less, ask more, and change the way you lead forever. I have absolutely loved this book. And what I will say is that, you don't have to be a coach to be able to coach. Coaching as a skill, as a tool, is something that all of us can use in any of the interactions we have. It is about asking more questions. It is about understanding things more deeply. And then it's about problem solving together. And I'll say this, as a parent, I find coaching very, very helpful. So, whether it's as a parent, whether it's as a friend, whether it's as a leader, whether it's as a teacher who works with students, I think the coaching skill is very, very helpful to be able to just take people from where they are to a better place.
I think as long as we kind of realize that we are continuously a work in progress, us and everybody around us, I think that's when the coaching kind of comes into play, right? All the time. It's about helping ourselves and helping others around us, right? And that's it.
I mean, my realization over time, I think, has been the really high need for compassion. And when I say compassion, it has to start with self-compassion. So I used to, for the longest time in my life, I think, be very hard on myself, forget other people, in terms of the expectations I had for myself, in terms of holding myself, to very high standards, and therefore, placing a lot of pressure on myself as well. And I think, reaching a place of, and it's a journey. I mean, I haven't by any means got there, but this journey of just being more self-compassionate, allowing myself to say, I don't know that, but I'll figure it out. I did it badly last time, but I'll do a better job of it next time, and that's fine. And then extending that to dealings with other people as well. I think that can be very, very empowering.
And, maybe moving to the last question out here, there's a question here from Kabir. He says, Diya, you have made the transition from being employed to becoming an entrepreneur. What motivated this change? You touched upon that. And what advice do you have for others looking to make a similar transition? It's a very different world, moving from a corporate world to this. So would love your thoughts.
I mean, I think I did it, I did it after 15 years. I see so many people, young people around me today taking the plunge much earlier in their, in their careers as well. So I've a couple of things that I would say. One is I was driven a lot also at the time by personal needs. I had kids who were young, and I wanted, my control time to be mine, to be able to control and things like that. And I think a lot of women get into freelancing and into entrepreneurial situations because of personal needs. But you may do it for professional reasons because you have a great idea and you want to create something of your own. And that's beautiful as well. So the reasons could be many. And I think they're all equally valid. But once you take the plunge and get to the other side, I think there are three things that I will say which I've realized are really, really crucial. One is you have to discipline yourself tremendously. That self-discipline is really important because when you work with an organization, you have boundaries that are set by the organization, right? Whether it's work timings, whether it's deliverables, whether it's whatever pace at which you have to turn things around. When you're on your own, you have to self-monitor. And I see a lot of people go through a slump when they first move out of a sort of an employment relationship, that productivity falls. Because you go through this sudden thing of, oh, I have all the time in the world. I can sort of, sit in my pajamas till 2 o'clock in the afternoon and only get to work at 3 in the afternoon, which is fine. And I'm not saying that getting to work at 9 o'clock in the morning is necessary for everyone, but I'm saying set your rhythm, right? Set your rhythm, set your pace, and kind of discipline yourself to stay with whatever rhythm works for you. So I think that's one that's really, really crucial. I think the other piece is to be able to do business development or sell or hunt, and to be able to deliver simultaneously is a learned skill. And one of the struggles that a lot of early entrepreneurs have is that if you're either spending all your energy on building the business, then you don't spend adequate focus on running the business and setting it up and delivering what needs to be done, right, on an operational level. Or if you get sucked into the operations, you'll suddenly realize you have a dry pipeline. So I think keeping an eye on both those balls and being able to balance that, I think, is really, really crucial. And this is particularly if you're starting out on your own, right? Not with a team and with an organizational structure. So that's the second. And I think the third is the need to constantly invest in your own development. Because the other thing that an organization does for you, at least most good progressive organizations, is that they invest in your skill building and your upgradation. When you're on your own, nobody else is going to do it for you. Do not run into the danger of thinking, I know it all, especially if you see early success and feel like, oh, I know it all now. And so that's great. I have all the fuel that's needed. You have to constantly invest in yourself and upgrade yourself and keep learning and keep developing yourself. And that nobody else is going to do for you as an entrepreneur. So take the money, spend the money on it, spend the time most importantly on it. Don't undermine the importance of that piece and the time that it needs. So I think these are the three things that, I think have been my kind of big learnings over the last 7 years.
I think these are some great points. I wish my younger self 15 years back, when I became an entrepreneur, had come across these, I think, wonderful points, which I'm going to keep in mind and definitely share with others. Really about self-discipline, focusing on building the business and selling. And the third part is about self-development. I think the third point especially is probably the most important in your journey as an entrepreneur, right?
Absolutely.
Lovely. I think, Diya, it was wonderful having you over. I really enjoyed this whole conversation. I think the whole chat did. And like I said, would urge you to just kind of visit the business and finance community and address so many questions which have not been answered. We just didn't have the time. And I really love the way you kind of maneuvered and navigated this, this topic, which otherwise is like walking on eggshells, right? Because this can be a very tricky topic. But I think the way you kind of, address those points and, really brought to, forward, some of the nuances, which I think we kind of completely missed, So thanks a lot. It was really a very, very educative process for me. I'm sure the community also loved it.
Sure. Thank you, Vivek. It was a really, really enjoyable interaction, and I'll absolutely be on the platform and, happy to answer more questions and happy to have people reach out. So look forward to that. Thank you.